Hey, we are on there.
Of course you are. So you have joined?
Join the studio?
Yes.
Yes, I just did.
Okay, so you can get added in. Oh yeah, that's you.
Mm-hmm. It's broadcasting right now?
It's broadcasting.
No,
yeah, well, it's not yet broadcasting, but that's that picture, right? So we can choose how we'd like this to be displayed, right? So this is.
It sounds pretty good, actually.
This is what you're filming, and this is the slides on loop, and then we can choose.
And that will be her slides too?
And that will become her slides when she's speaking.
This is the way to do it. This is it, I think.
She doesn't want to be on camera.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, she said, "Can we not?"
Testing
So
1, 2,
she would prefer
3,
it to
check
be-
1, 2.
Really?
That's what she
Hello,
asked.
hello. Testing.
So
testing,
I will switch it.
Audio.
Someone else just switched it.
Tristan,
Testing the audio.
I think
is
you're
a little
sort of
loud.
both in control. So another thing we learned when we were doing this the other day is
Put the bomb
not that
in
you
the bomb.
might do this,
Shabam,
you can't
shabam.
move to another browser window or another app while you're recording,
Okay.
or
How's
it
that
will
sound?
knock the stream.
Good.
Okay.
So you have to keep this open.
I can't turn it off now?
No.
So, okay.
Right? Is this correct?
You can leave.
She can't
come
leave.
back. I just have to put you back in on the screen, or you can do it yourself.
But
actually.
she's recording.
But it'll stop doing split screen and just go to the one.
Yes,
then I can-
right? Karen
so I
can't
can click-
navigate away from this screen if she's recording, because that's what happened the other day when we were testing this.
I'm the person who's making it into a YouTube.
Yes.
Oh, you mean like her standing there?
No.
Physical
This
person.
iPad has to be going, or else it's not streaming to
We're just
YouTube.
figuring out
Is
the
that correct?
It's the audio. It's really only the audio we're after.
But also the image of the opening remarks and stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm gonna do more.
So
Thank you.
So I guess I need to double check this. You're gonna switch between.
That and that. Right?
Yeah, I
That's
think
it.
she also didn't want the picture-in-picture, but it's up to you.
But this is just for the opening remarks.
yes.
And then when she starts speaking, we're gonna put it on that one, and that's gonna be
Yeah.
it.
You may do
God,
that
I'm gonna get gaffer's tape.
But
for the opening remarks.
So we may have up to 50.
Well, whatever you want to do.
We're figuring
I think this is good because we're trying to give everybody credit. Why did you take my tape?
Is
Um,
if you peek in here, you can see how this is what Karen's filming, and these are the slides. So it'll be oopsie picture in picture like that.
Looks great.
Yeah. And then this will be live.
I just worry that if I'm gonna, can I turn it off for like 15
Yeah,
minutes?
you can
I just-
rejoin. Yeah.
Great. I'm gonna.
The link
I'm gonna
stays the
X.
same.
So I shouldn't end broadcast. I can just turn it off.
Oh, you're in this view. I see. I haven't done this from this.
Is
end
everyone
before.
hearing us? Well,
it's
We're not live yet.
oh, it says live, but it's not.
It's live here, but not on YouTube, and no one can see this but us.
I got it.
Yeah.
When I
And this won't get recorded and added later.
No, because YouTube does the
she
transcoding.
did her mic check and her.
YouTube
we have
does
a
the,
clicker up there.
Transcoding too. Like so, YouTube is
She's-
the only
she's done her
thing
tech
that
run
gets
through.
recorded.
and they will not start
I
the
would like
transmission
to
until
join
the assigned time of
Yeah.
1:45.
If you hit end broadcast, the RTMP link will expire, and everyone's login will get
I know.
screwed up.
So I'm not gonna
Super
do that.
duper don't do that. So I'm just confused. How are you?
Hey, sorry to bug you.
Uh-huh.
Is this a service issue for me, or because I'm trying to click the link that you shared with everyone to join this?
Oh,
and
that's
it
the
just
kind of
keeps-
tape I like.
Let's get
Here.
gaffer's tape.
That's-
Yeah.
I
I'm
just
just
want
gonna.
to see what people
thank
are
you.
seeing
Perfect.
in this feed now.
Are you logged
That's
into
plenty.
the StreamYard?
Thank
Good?
you.
You sure?
Positive.
Live
you.
in 16.
I'm doing a little one right here.
Great. Am I logged into who?
I think you just navigate out of the page. There's usually a leave studio
Well, I'd like
button.
to. Can you
Well, I'm at
You're-
100.
You're just
so-
in as
Yeah.
you're
Hi.
just in as a
Can you
guest,
just-
right?
broadcast so we can see what it looks like if this happens now? I think this is something we can troubleshoot.
What do you mean?
I would like to see what people are seeing on YouTube.
No one's seeing anything.
No, I'm saying,
So once
can
you
you
see
go
that-
live
Yes,
so we can
so
see what happens?
Once you go live, you stay live.
Yes,
Yeah.
I know.
Okay.
But that seems fine at this
Yeah.
point because worst
Yeah.
case scenario will
Good afternoon. How lovely to see you all out there. My name's Maria DeWald, and I have the honor of being president of the board of the Beatrix Farron Garden Association. And as you may know, it's been a while since we've been able to have this, so it's particularly wonderful to see you. And the mission of the association continues to be to restore and maintain the Beatrix Farron Garden here at Bellefield, and to educate people about Beatrix's rich horticultural legacy and her important influence as an American landscape designer. We've had a 3-year hiatus from our design lecture, but it is the 14th annual Bellefield Design Lecture. And we so appreciate the support the garden has received during this hiatus and your presence here today. And what a time it is to be back. It is the year we celebrate Beatrix's 150th birthday and the 110th anniversary of the installation of our treasured garden at Bellefield. A little side story to that is, the garden was actually donated to the National Park Service in approximately 1975. And then, because of a very wonderful grant from the Orange Duchess Garden Club and their Special Projects Committee, they took on the project of restoring the garden, which was fallow at that point. It had been fallow for about 20 years, or it was fallow, for the 20 years it took them to restore the garden, or to start to restore the garden in 1994. And that was a volunteer effort, and to a very large extent, it remains so. We still have volunteer weeders in the garden, and we still have a volunteer board, and lots of times along the way, the weeders were also the board of directors. So it is a volunteer organization, and that makes it all the more astounding to have the beautiful garden we have today. There's many, many people to thank today, not only for their ongoing care and maintenance of the garden and the association. And first, let me thank all the generous sponsors and advertisers for today's event. You've been seeing their names up here, and they're also printed in your program. And I encourage you to support them, not only as quality providers, but also to thank them for their support of the garden and its work, which is crucial to our success. And I'd also like to thank our partner, the National Park Service, and special thanks to Amy Bracewell, who is the superintendent of the Roosevelt Vanderbilt National Historical Sites, and David Hayes, Chief of Facilities and Resource Management. And I want to say thanks to Josie Whalen, too. She's the administrative assistant, and she's always there to help us book our board meetings and anything like today, where we're having a little reception afterwards. And all the National Park Service crew who do so much to help us, and very, very most especially, thanks to Anna DeCordova, who is the parks horticulturist and our partner liaison. And she sits on our board and really just does everything we could possibly ask from a liaison. Thank you, Anna, for all you do for us. We are also very thankful, of course, in that hiatus, we really didn't have any staff for a while. And we're thankful to have our very new programming and marketing director, Michelle Montalbano, with us. And she's only been here a few months, and she has had a very speedy transition to our association. And Michelle, welcome to Duchess and our garden, and really for the remarkable job you did on such short notice. And I must also thank our spirited band of volunteers. We have a group of weeders who come every Tuesday and Saturday morning at 9 a.m. And they're the ones with our horticulturists who maintain this garden, just like when it was restored back starting in 1994. We're always looking to add to the group. So if you would like to come and weed, we're happy to have you. Just let us know, 9 o'clock, Tuesdays and Saturday mornings. We also have a volunteer who just sits in the garden every other Sunday and just welcomes and greets any people that might come in strolling through. You know, it's a public garden, it's open to the public. You never know how many or who's going to be there. So we usually try to have somebody sitting in the garden and point out that there is an audio show you can do with your cell phone. And corralling that spirited band of volunteers is our enthusiastic and ever-encouraging horticulturist, Karen Wolftuck. Thank you, Karen. For the joy and the true joy and expertise you bring to your work in the garden, as well as for the online plant sales that you planned. We just finished one this week. And by the way, there will be a few extra plants from that plant sale available for free will donation in the reception in the garden later. And I, of course, do not want to be remiss and not thank Linda Patchner, who was our board chair, was called away for a family emergency. But she and her incredible team of volunteers, especially Helen Page and Linda Freisitzers, who I'll just say acted as co-chairs, and others who worked tirelessly on this event. I realized that this hybrid event, which is another first for us, never knowing when or if we could actually do it, held its own new challenges, from invitation to design, to digital designs, to check-ins, to flower arrangements. We really could not have done it without Linda and her team. Thank you also to our dedicated Board of Trustees and our advisory committee. And collectively, you do help to make this the special place that it is. And it is truly unique in many ways. Just all the board members and volunteers and weeders and advisors, if you're here, just wave your hand and let us say thank you. I like to call, I've been on the board about 5 years, and I'd like to call our association and partners the little engine that could. Because even in these last few trying years, we have managed together to support and maintain the garden, to watch our documentary, the Beatrix Farrand American Landscapes, which had been aired on PBS and is still available for streaming on Amazon. What a wonderful, wonderful reception it had. And to hold our first free summer open to the public cultural arts programs in the garden. And in that regard, I'd like to, in advance, please ask you and invite you to join us for the first of this season, which will be the celebration of Beatrix's 150th birthday party. And that will be on June 18th. It's a Saturday. It will go from 11:30 to 2:30. And we will have a chamber quartet playing period pieces, one of which, by the way, is our, again, ever-talented horticulturist, who's also an artist, but a wonderful professional chamber music performance, and a birthday cake, of course, and also some making of paper flowers, paper peonies. It's open and free. There'll be lots going on at the National Park besides our party. So we expect it to be very festive. So please join us. Come, bring your family, friends, celebrate Beatrix's lovely legacy, which is alive and thriving in this garden. And lastly, I'd like to ask Karen to come up because we have a very special new project coming up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, I'll say again. And you have your programs with you that have a beautiful center spread that discusses an exciting project that we're announcing today. There's been a project in the making for years, even before I was hired, by the previous horticulturist Ann Sims and Anna de Cordova and some of our board of advisors to put together a realization project of a wild garden that Beatrix Farrand intended for our site. So some of you who've been here before know that we don't have a planting plan for what she put in the garden, but we do have a really beautiful drawing of the layout of the garden that included in her handwriting the name Wild Garden around the exterior of the plan. So since she did put wild gardens into some of her other designs that we have records for, they have done, the previous people before me made this beautiful plan for a wild garden to be installed at Bellefield. So we're breaking ground this year. The project has already started. And we were really fortunate to receive a very generous lead gift that was able to get us going. So we have a goal of $150,000 that we're going to raise in the next 3 years with all of our help. We're all going to do this together and get this project going. But you'll go out and see during the reception that the large silver maple next to the garden is actually in the process of being removed. That's the beginning stages of what's happening. We're going to have some of the older trees and unhistoric shrubs taken away from the exterior and get the site prepped. So you'll see different stages of development over the next few years. And we're also going to have some programs that coincide with learning about her plantings and her aesthetic and what we're doing. So just keep on our mailing list and read about it in your program. And we can't wait to see how this all develops with all of our help in the next few years. So big, exciting thing. On her 150th birthday, it's a good time to announce this big new project. So. Yeah.
How could we go wrong, right? 150th birthday, Karen, and all our wonderful volunteers. So all of this, friends of the garden, has always been, and will always be accomplished only because of your support. For those of you who have become members this year, thank you, thank you, thank you. For those who haven't, you still can. And while your membership support is crucial to our ability to continue, we know you also will have ample opportunity to also both enjoy your many membership benefits and to really become a steward in this garden. Again, my sincere welcome. I thank you on behalf of all the board and staff. And now please welcome our new Director of Programming and Marketing, Michelle Montalbano, who will introduce our speaker, Susan Cohen.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you all for a third or fourth time for coming today. And this introduction serves two purposes, both to introduce our esteemed speaker, which is my distinct pleasure, and to introduce myself to all of you. And I so look forward to having a chance to meet you all in the garden during the reception, get to know you better. Again, Michelle Montalbano, multi-syllabic last name, multi-syllabic title, Director of Programming and Development, Marketing, so forth. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Susan Cohen to speak to us today about finding design, garden making, and the creative process. Noted landscape architect, teacher, and lecturer, Susan Cohen is the author of the lushly illustrated book, The Inspired Landscape, 21 Leading Landscape Architects Explore the Creative Process. A fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, she received the prestigious George A. Yarwood Award from the Connecticut chapter of ASLA in 2016. She is the coordinator of the Landscape Design Program at the New York Botanic Garden and is the founding coordinator of the acclaimed Landscape Design Portfolio series. Susan Cohen is known for the use of natural materials in her elegantly designed residential landscapes, as well as for the two celebrated exhibition gardens she created for the New York Botanical Garden, Momiji-gari, the Japanese autumn garden, and sculptures from the Museum of Modern Art. She also co-designed the garden's Kiku show, which celebrated the importance of meticulously trained chrysanthemums in Japanese culture. It is my pleasure to invite Susan Cohen up to the stage. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. It is really an honor to be the 14th speaker in this prestigious series, and I know several of my predecessors, and it is a great pleasure to be here. I thought before I started, I would talk a little bit just about how I came to write a book, how I came to be a landscape architect, because this is a moment where we're combining the pleasure of gardens, and of course it's the height of peony and rose season. I can't believe so many of you were inside instead of being outside today, but it's, so I was a gardener, my mother was a gardener, my father was an engineer, many years after I was already a landscape architect, it occurred to me that if you genetically cross a gardener with an engineer, you get a landscape architect, which doesn't explain how my sister became a lawyer, but I started as a gardener, and I took courses at the New York Botanical Garden and then went to landscape architecture school and I found out very late about landscape architecture. I was gardening, I was reading gardening books, but one day I heard the words landscape architect together. And I had never heard of Beatrix Farrand. I had never heard of the field of landscape architecture. I was 30, I had 2 children, I had no career, and I went back to school. So I like to tell my students that because at the New York Botanical Garden, most people are picking up landscape design as a second career after other choices. And just a word about the book. I guess about almost a decade ago now, quite a few years ago, I picked up the phone and a woman was on the phone asking me, telling me she was an editor at Timber Press. And I was wondering how she got my home number. I assumed she was having a Timber Press new book release and wanted to offer it to the garden as a textbook for landscape design. But no, she was saying, it was hard to fathom what she was saying. She was saying, do you know Timber Press? Yes. Do you have some of our books? Yes. She said, well, we've never written a book about landscape architecture and we want you to write it. And all that, so I heard that finally and I thought, oh, she's calling to ask me who should write the book because she could tell I knew a lot of landscape architects because of the series of landscape architects who speak at NYBG. But no, she was asking me to write the book. And I decided not to recommend anyone else. And it took quite a few years, but here's the book. I wanted to write a book about landscape architecture for 2 reasons. One, I was an English major, and I kind of always wanted to write a book. So the other reason is that I wanted people to know what landscape architects did, and maybe at a younger age than I found out, because it is an amazing profession. And we're here today because of one of the most amazing practitioners. So I have a clicker to start. That may answer some of the questions that you already have about why I happen to be here. Well, it's a very speedy clicker. One of the things landscape architects do when they visit a new site is they look around, they try to figure out what's wrong, what could be right, what could be better. But basically, what we do is make decisions about design. And when we express those decisions first, usually, at least before the age of computers, which are parallel, perpendicular to the floor, is we make plans. And this is an example of a plan for a garden that you'll see a bit later. Happens to be in Japan. But if you can see, this is a bird's eye view. This is the critical thing to becoming a designer, is to be able to look at a bird's eye view of something and see that those are treetops and the blue is water and the darker color may be a rooftop or a path. But what we do is make designs. And when I was in school, we had pencils. We didn't have computers. So I still have pencils. But the thing is, the question always is when we get to a new job is, where do we start? What do we do? And the site, of course, tells you the weather, the sun, the shade, the wind, what's next door, the location, the needs of the client, also the needs of the land. You don't want to, the first precept should be like doctors, do no harm to the land. But this is what we start with. And when we're in school and when we're young in our careers, and maybe even still when we're farther along, we face the dreaded blank page. Those of you who are artists may find that as well. I don't know, but I remember being absolutely terrified through most of the years that I was in school because the woman who sat next to me had so many years of training before she got to landscape architecture school that she would just start doing these beautiful things and I was frozen. So what do we do? Well, sometimes we whoops. We hope for an idea, and sometimes it comes. But sometimes we hope for a muse. And as you know, the ancient Greeks loved their muses, who inspired them, who sat on their shoulders and breathed, hence the word inspiration, breathed, knowledge of both the arts and science. And the reason that this muse is very important to landscape architects is that landscape architecture is a profession that combines the arts and the sciences. And I like this rendering. It came straight from clip art somewhere on the internet, because I think she's playing the lyre, obviously, so she's the muse of musicians, but also that looks like a kind of universal image of a vine. So I consider her the muse of landscape architects. So where does inspiration come from? That's really what the book is about. I decided to write a book about inspiration in landscape architecture projects after I was, a talk I had with a landscape architect who, I asked what was her favorite garden. And she said it was Versailles. And I thought, that can't be. Her work is nothing like Versailles. It's gentle on the land. It responds to the social needs of the people, which, you know, King Louis XIV did not respond to the social needs of the people when he tore down 13 or 14 villages to create Versailles. So it was just an odd thing to say, but it was a dinner, and you know, I thought, well, maybe she's nervous, and she just said the first thing that popped in her mind. And then we went around the table. Actually, Lyndon Miller was there as well. You all know Lyndon, she's been a speaker here. And people were just saying what their favorite gardens were and why. And then this woman, when it came back to her, said, you know, I want to change that. Versailles is not my favorite garden. She said, my favorite garden isn't a garden. It's the memorial place in Israel for Ben Gurion, who had died. And she said, that memorial site has inspired me my entire career. And that's what the inspiration was for the book. I wondered what had truly inspired other landscape architects in their work. That the creator of that gravesite for Ben Gurion is in the book, and you'll see what he did in another project. So, inspiration. Vincent van Gogh, he has two quotations here that are seemingly in opposition, but I think appropriately so. So, if you buy a shopping bag at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, it comes with writing on it that says, the painting comes to me as if in a dream, which makes sense, right? Van Gogh, he was very dreamy. But then elsewhere, there's a brochure that says this, great things are not done by impulse, but by a series of small things brought together. And I think that's probably more true than not, and you can judge for yourselves after seeing some of these projects. One of my favorite people in the world who died about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, was Cornelia Oberlander, who was a dear friend and mentor to me and was always giving me advice. And when I decided to write this book and asked her if she would be in it, she said, well, I don't really know about what to tell you about inspiration, because sometimes it just comes to me in a flash. But then when we talked about it more, I realized that that wasn't really, of course she had flashes of inspiration, but she's known for her library. She once told me, I don't have to go to the public library. I have every book I need right here. And she said, Susan, remember this piece of advice, always do your research. She said, I do research till I'm blue in the face. And she would say that a lot. So this is Cornelia in her library, taken about 6 or 7 years ago now. She was 99 when she died last year in May, and she was working on a project even then. And that's one of the great things about landscape architects. They can just keep going. You never have to stop. But there are two particular books that she used for a project I'm going to show you. And one is in her lap, or next to her lap, the one on the left-hand corner, a photography book by Blasfeld, the works of Blasfeld. And the other was a book by Archibald Mendes, who explored on the boat, the ship, the Discovery, in the late 1700s, the west coast of Vancouver on an expedition, and who recorded all of the plants that were in what is now Western Vancouver. And it was named for George Vancouver, the captain of the ship, but it wasn't Vancouver yet. You might know Cornelia's work. Her career was in Vancouver, Canada, but in the upper right here, this may be familiar to you from the ads in the New York Times for the New York Times itself, because this is the courtyard of the New York Times building. And she talked about research. She insisted that the team, Renzo Piano was the architect, hire a climate person to decide how much sun would be in the site. It's an interior atrium, and then therefore what could be planted. And her first idea was a grove of trees, but she proved to Renzo Piano that he couldn't have a complete grove of trees because the trees would only flourish in one corner of the site. One of the books I mentioned was this photography book by Blasfeld. And as Cornelia was doing research for a project she was involved in, she came across this picture and called the architect, who immediately agreed that the roof garden she was designing need not be flat. And instead, the roof design for this visitor center at the Van Dusen Botanic Garden in Vancouver was designed to resemble a series of orchid leaves. And all of the plants on the site, the part of the site that Cornelia was responsible for, were native plants, but we all have this discussion now about what's native and what's not native. She said, we are going to use plants that are listed by Archibald Mendes in his book. And his list of plants, and she had it, it was published. So every plant that she put in was something that was truly in Vancouver and not brought by European settlers. So there's the shape of the roof inspired by the orchid leaf. This is a view, a strange view, but that is the roof, which is planted with small native grasses and nodding onions. And the background to the roof is the existing forest of trees in the grove behind it. Two more views, the visitor center. There's planting below this pedestrian bridge, which is Cornelia's. And then she did the rainwater garden here. I guess she was about 90, 89, 90 when she planted this. And she told me, I placed every plant. She said, I had my hip boots on and I placed every plant. Come on. I think I'm not pushing right. Okay. So what I decided to do was to show you a selection of projects from the book. And in the book, they're alphabetically organized by the landscape architect's last name. But I decided to try to set some categories. The categories are just for today. They're just my artificial categories, but they kind of make sense to me. And the first category is inspirations by art. And I'll show two. The first one is this. It's the New York Botanical Garden. So maybe many of you have been there and been there recently. This is the native plant garden designed by Sheila Brady of Omibund, Sweden. And she told me the story of trying to figure out what the water feature, was going to be. Gregory Long, the president of the garden, had said he did not want the water feature to be naturalistic. He wanted it to be, in some ways, contemporary. And one day she was working at her home outside of Washington, D.C., and said that she was so frustrated she had tracing paper scraps all over the floor trying to decide what this water feature would look like. And she kind of gave up and went to the National Gallery to see an art show of work by Martin Puryear, who she admired a lot. And the show, you may have seen it because it was at MoMA in New York before it went to the National Gallery. And she came across the work on the left called Basque, which was made in 1976 of painted wood. It's about 12 feet long, so if you can picture the size of maybe a kayak, something like that. And she made a note of it and said, maybe I can use that shape as a waterfall. She went back home and started sketching and realized that it wasn't going to work as a waterfall shape, but it could work actually as the shape of her proposed water feature. So this is the finished one, and you can see the echoes of the Basque sculpture in the final shape. The key thing is that there are straight lines on your right side and a curved one on the left, which made sense because the water feature meets a hillside on the left side. On the right, it's more flat, and that's where the pedestrian walkway was going to be. So this is the sketch she made, an evolution from that sculpture. You know, I can't make this up, it's really true. But when you think of it, imagine just going to a museum, seeing a piece of sculpture 12 feet long on a wood floor, and being able to imagine that could be in a garden, but it's not 12 feet, you know, it's hundreds of feet. And this is the final drawing. So I can point out, this is the visitor center, Hugh Hardy's design. The walkway goes like this and around here. This is the split rock that was always there. And then we're a little bit off the screen here, and then it continues around. And it's a very, very, one of the most visited parts of the garden now. This is the ground level view looking across, and up here, you can sort of see on this slope is a very large meadow. But Sheila Brady wasn't just inspired once. Lightning didn't strike one, it struck twice, because she decided that as an inspiration for the meadow, she would follow the work of one of her other favorite artists, Joan Mitchell. And this is a Joan Mitchell work. She's one of my favorite artists too. And inspired by Joan Mitchell's paintings, Sheila made this sketch plan for the meadow. If you're close up, you can read some of the actual plant names. The picture's in the book. And this is a view of the meadow in the late summer, early fall. Another artist who served as inspiration kind of a quite different way is Van Gogh, whose Wheat Fields with Cypresses, 1889, I think, is now at the Metropolitan Museum as part of the Annenberg collection. But originally, it was at Sunnylands, at the home of the Rancho Mirage home in California of Walter and Leonore Annenberg, Ambassador and Mrs. Annenberg. And after Ambassador Annenberg died, it was decided that part of the land would become a visitor center. You may have heard of Sunnylands because it was kind of a Western White House for meetings, secret meetings with foreign dignitaries. Presidents were given the use of the place at their convenience to use if they needed it for meetings, and a lot of historical events happened in the main house at Sunnylands. The visitor center was being built at the adjacent property, and James Burnett was chosen to do the landscape. And he was inspired by this painting, which wasn't anymore on the walls. Instead, the entire Annenberg collection, which is now at the Met, takes up several rooms. The reproductions of all those works were hung on the walls as they had been. So when James was interviewing, he was given a tour and he was struck by this painting. And it stayed in his mind. And you can see even his sketch plan here on the right has echoes of the shapes in the Van Gogh painting. Just this kind of wild, free-flowing drawing has echoes of the clouds in the painting. But it was more than that. When he proposed his ideas to Mrs. Annenberg, he said he wanted to use plants that were native to the desert. And she said, I don't want cactuses and mulch. And she said, and she was very skeptical apparently. But she said to him, but if you make it beautiful, if you promise me you will make it beautiful, then I'll go along with it. So he promised, and he fulfilled his promise, and this is what it looks like. And actually, if I go back to the Van Gogh painting, and then go forward to this view, and you squint a little bit, you know, you actually can see the echoes of Van Gogh. Certainly the color scheme. The wheat fields are yellow, and the yellow is the primary color in the James Burnett's plant palette here. Another view, these amazing trees of the Southwest that bloom yellow in spring. And most of it is, it's not exactly a wild garden. It isn't a wild garden, but it's a very impressionistic garden. This circle that you see is one of very few features that are purely geometrical. Everything else really flows. This is the geometrical part. It's one, I love the circle. Landscape architects love pure geometrical lines, like circles and squares, you know, but, and on the left here, you can see a glimpse of one other piece of geometry, which is a labyrinth, a meditative place to walk. Well, nature is another big category. It's probably the one you would think of before art as an inspiration for landscape architects. But nature can sometimes be kind of dangerous, not too convenient, as in the case of these desert wadis in Israel, which are riverbeds that are mostly dry, but they can flood quite dangerously. And they're characteristic of the Negev desert. And this is where Ben Gurion University of the Negev is located. And Shlomo Aronson, who designed the memorial to Ben Gurion that I mentioned previously, was invited to design a new plaza near a student center among academic buildings. And I don't remember even knowing what this site looked like before, but I gather it was not designed in any way. And what Shlomo Aronson said is, why don't we take our inspiration from where this place is? You know, there is a bit of lawn. When I was there, students were sitting on bits of lawn, reading books and chatting, leaning against a tree to read. But basically, this plaza was inspired by the look and feel of a desert wadi. And you can see it in the picture on the right, how this meandering form is interpreted here. There are no safety rails. You have to watch where you're going. Probably in, you know, Hyde Park, they wouldn't allow it in a public place, but you can step over it easily, and in places you can sit. Here's the, whoops, hang on. Here's the sort of so-called source of the wadi here, a series of rocks, and it just wanders and splits off in the site. And a lot of the planting is naturalistic, but then, as I said, there are some places where students can and faculty can sit, such as here. It's very enticing. When I was there, a student was sitting by himself on a bench, and I was just running around taking as many pictures as I could. And he called me over and he said, perfect English. Everybody in Israel seems to speak perfect English. What are you doing? Why are you taking pictures? I said, well, I'm writing a book and I'm taking pictures for a book. And he said, well, I have to tell you something. He said, if you're writing a book about this, he said, what's here, this plaza, it's very difficult to do this in a desert. So I said, do you like it? He said, we all love it. What you can't see in the photographs is the fact that the sound is just so enticing. It's really magical, and that's another thing that landscape architects, think about. Having sound, having breezes, not necessarily putting bells in trees, but if you can do a water feature, it's an opportunity. And Aronson placed the rocks specifically so the sound would be very pleasing. And it's delightful. So nature, not the nature you might think of. Culture. Culture is a big factor. You wouldn't do, sometimes people know I've been to Japan quite a bit. They say, well, do you design Japanese gardens for people? I said, not really, because, you know, if you put a Japanese garden behind a colonial house in Connecticut, it's going to look a little strange. The ones I did design were for the New York Botanical Garden as exhibition gardens. They're clearly in a place that's already made to be a sort of a stage, a temporary garden. And one of the reasons it's so hard to translate culture is because there are things that you don't know. So for example, at this is actually the garden you saw the slide of in the beginning with the Sumagawa shrine. When I was there the first time, I saw this waterfall with this rock. Whoops, I'm not really good at this. With this rock. And I said, well, that's awkward. And I know this designer's work. Shunno Masano is his name. And I said, why would he put that awkward rock there? And then it hit me. That's the rock is meant to be the carp who swims and struggles upstream in Chinese and Japanese mythology to become a dragon. And it's a symbol of strength, and it's a symbol of strength for children, especially little boys. And that's this on the left, you see an American's interpretation of that event. Actually, he's an American who went to Japan to learn how to do this technique of painting. And this is what you've probably all seen and wondered, you know, why were these always sold in Japanese stores? But this is the carp that swims upstream, very brave and very strong, to become a dragon. And it's symbolized, it used to symbolize Boys' Day in Japan. I think it's May 5th, but now it's Children's Day. Yay. And there it was in the garden. So the garden was made by the wonderful landscape architect named Shunno Masano, who is also a Zen priest. And not just a Zen priest, but he's the head priest of his own temple, which he runs with his brother. And he kind of divides his time between being a priest and being a landscape architect. His work is amazing, does private homes as well. And here he is in his priestly robes with that angelic smile, which is what he looks like all the time. So he was invited to design a new garden for this Shinto shrine. And he asked, and of course he's a Zen priest, so I asked him, well, how did a Shinto shrine hire a Zen priest, landscape architect, to do a project, you know, because there's a difference between Shinto and Zen. And he said, I was asked to do a garden that reflected the beauties of Japanese culture. And so that's what he did. And then he explained how Zen and Shinto are sometimes hand in hand and sometimes even on the same site. And I think there's a saying that every Japanese is born a Shinto and in Shinto and dies a Buddhist, but don't quote me on that. So what inspired this landscape architect was his deep knowledge of the history and culture of Japanese gardens. Like Saihoji, which you might know as the moss garden in Kyoto, which is like the one he was asked to design, a stroll garden. And this is the man who designed this garden in the 1339, so hundreds of years apart. He was also multi-talented. He was an interpreter, a poet, a writer, a priest, and a garden designer. And I think, though they're hundreds of years apart, centuries apart, I think you can almost see the same feeling in these two, the painting and the portrait photograph. This is a bridge that Masano designed in the modern style. I think I may have skipped the antecedent. Yes, and this is the one in Katsura, the Imperial Villa of Katsura, a very famous garden also in Kyoto. So here's the original moss bridge, and here's his interpretation of it, more contemporary. Similarly, here's a little piece of Saihoji, a gate. Notice the paving and the panels in the gateway. And Masano's interpretation. You can see the similar woodwork, similar paving, but a more contemporary feel. Art and culture are combined in this landscape architect who you might have heard of, Ken Smith. Like many landscape architects, he started as an artist. He never stopped being an artist. And here he is sitting in a part of the Museum of Modern Art in New York that you might never see. It's a roof garden, but it's only meant to be viewed by people who live in the apartments nearby. So when MoMA was remodeled a decade or two ago, the people who were tenants in the adjoining apartment buildings had the right to vote on whether what happened on the site. And they didn't like looking down at an asphalt roof. So they said, well, we'll only agree to this plan if you make something nice on the roof. So Ken Smith was hired and he showed them a plan. You can see somewhat what it looks like because it was finished and he's sitting in it. And it was all made of synthetic materials. And the board of this apartment building objected in saying, no, if those plants look like boxwood, but we want real boxwood. So Ken did a test and he put in real boxwood as a display and he put in the plastic boxwood as a display and the board voted on the plastic. So how do you make a synthetic garden? Where do you look to for inspiration? Ken Smith never lacks for inspiration. So here are views of the two roofs as they were built, probably taken from one of those apartment buildings. And this was one of his inspirations. This is a set from a film made in 1954 French film by Jacques Tati called Mon Oncle. You may have seen it. And Ken was looking at it on television, I think, and he realized that this set gave him some certain precedence for what he was trying to do at MoMA. He said it was a huge influence. Actually, I was getting in the elevator leaving his office when he was like Columbo and he called me back. He said, I just remembered another influence on this garden. So I had to rent it from the Greenwich Public Library and watch it. And then of course I saw, this is a photograph of a set, not the film because you can't find, at least I couldn't find the actual film. I tried filming it from my TV screen, it didn't work. But you can see the synthetic quality of this, the exaggerated paths, the gravel, fake lawn, synthetic. There's even, you can't really see it very well, but there's a fake fish spitting water into a pond here. And in the film, if a real leaf falls on the garden, somebody whisks it away. So there's no real reality here. So that was one of his influences. Another was this pair of camouflage pants that his wife brought home and which he confiscated, and he had his staff put it on a photocopy machine and then put it in a computer and then distort it because Ken had always been fascinated by camouflage patterns. And you can see in the garden, you will see how he used those patterns. That was his main influence, was a pair of pants that his wife bought on 14th Street. So in a way, it was street art because it was just clothing sold on the street. And I think he also saw this garden. He's been to Japan. He'd seen all the Japanese gardens in a complex called Daitokuji, and this is there. This garden is actually made in the 1960s in a reinterpretation of the more ancient dry gardens of Japan. But to me, this one looks most like what Ken actually did at MoMA, which has similarities to this garden, which is a hybrid garden. It's part Japanese, it's part Western, and it was done by Noguchi, who you know was part Western and part Japanese himself in heritage. It's the Peace Garden on the roof of the UNESCO building in Paris. And it was made by chance in 1954, the same year as the film Monarch was made. So you can see echoes of that. And Ken mentioned this garden as well. I saw it in the 60s, or maybe I saw it in the 70s. I don't know if it's open to the public anymore. And there are really not very good pictures of it around. And this is Ken's favorite garden, he told me. It's called Dyson Inn. It's part of that Daitokuchi complex in Kyoto where there are many gardens. And it's telling that this is his favorite garden because if I go forward, you can see all the elements and all the inspirations that I mentioned here. The cones of sand and gravel from Dyson Inn are here. This is definitely echoes of Monarch in these paths. There's a synthetic boxwood, synthetic water, just painted water. I think that's the last picture for that. I'm going to breeze through this one. It's landscape history, but in landscape architecture school, we do not breeze through landscape history. And at the New York Botanical Garden, we have the first course. We have 2 courses that are required before you start designing. One is graphics, so you know how to use a scale and a pencil and paper. And the other one is landscape history. Tom Stewart Smith is a wonderful landscape architect from England, very famous. This is a small project he did, a private project, which was influenced in its shape by the Villa Lante, one of the gardens that every landscape architect studies, this garden from the late 1600s, early 1700s in Italy. This is a plan of it. What you can kind of get from this plan is the way it starts on the top of a hillside and it just comes down and down and down. The water goes all different directions, and finally you end up in this open plat of water. But the trick of this garden is how it handles a slope and makes many different design decisions. Also, it's an unusual garden because it's a villa garden, but the villa isn't in one piece, it's in 2, like little casinos. So this is the Villa Lante, but whoops, sorry. But this is also Villa Lante. And in Tom's sketch, you can see that the garden steps down a hillside. It's a little distorted, but it starts at the right and goes down the hill like this. And the water follows in different ways. Here's a pond, a square pond here, and you'll see some of that. But he's not only a landscape garden, the architect in England, but he's a landscape historian as well. So when he saw this site, he knew what to do. This is looking down. Those are Irish yews and a lot of Mediterranean plants. It's beautifully colorful in the summer. And you can see the canal of water on the right and the pond in the middle. And further down, you see these parterres of boxwood, but the pattern seems a little random and odd, and that's because he took leaves from the trees that were growing around this garden, and he looked at them under a microscope, and then he took their cell structure, and then he designed the boxwood parterres based on their cell structure. It ends up being absolutely gorgeous, but also it has some history to it. The last category is personal history. Kung Jian-yu is an amazing landscape architect as well from China, who grew up on his family farm. He was in charge of the water buffalo. I asked him if everybody had a water buffalo, and he just laughed. He said, "Susan, it was the village. We had one water buffalo for the whole village." But he was in charge of it as a young boy. He was also not allowed during the Cultural Revolution. The children in his family were not allowed to go to school because his family owned a little land and all the other farmers didn't. And just because they owned a little land, they were punished. And his punishment was not to go to school. Luckily, he learned to read, and he could sit on the back of the water buffalo and read. And finally, when things changed politically and he was able to get to school, he learned a lot. And it's not many boys who grow up riding water buffaloes and semi-literate who end up teaching at Harvard, but he does. He did, and he does. So his father was the great expert of the rice paddies. That he was the father, Kung John's father had the knowledge of when to let the sluice gates open and when to close them, and what time of month when the moon was at a certain height that should happen. And he imparted all that almost by osmosis, fittingly enough, to Kung Jun Yu, because he would just go out and keep his father company, and he learned about that. So he's a very famous landscape architect. He has a firm with, last I heard, 800 people. He founded a school in Beijing for landscape architecture. He's a guest lecturer and teacher, professor at Harvard. And he was asked by this agricultural, in this agricultural area, to design a landscape for a new school. And he was met by the board of the school and the president of the school and told, typically, we hear this all the time as landscape architects, we've run out of money. The building costs more than we thought, so we don't have any money yet left over. We really have almost no budget. What can you do to help? And he built huge public parks. You can see, just look him up online. It's amazing what he's built. But he said, would you consider perhaps rice? So this became known as, the rice landscape, the rice field landscape, because he could tell, he told me, because he grew up on a rice farm, he could tell us by looking at the soil, even though it was a site filled with debris, that it was a good place to grow rice. So he designed a rice campus. One second. And you see part of it on the right here. And that's his own farm on the left. So this is his sketch. I showed you Sheila Brady's sketch. I love having access to the preliminary sketches by designers because you see their thoughts on paper. And he did a grid. That makes sense for rice paddies to do a grid because water does flow in a straight line. But also, he took an advanced degree in landscape architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And the leading people there were Dan Kiley, and he probably left by then, but Pete Walker was teaching. Peter Walker designed the landscape around the World Trade Center Memorial. Pete Walker and all the practitioners at that time loved the grid, and they did beautiful, elegant designs based on grid paving or grid patterns or grids of trees. And if you go downtown to the World Trade Center Memorial, you see all those swamp oaks in grids, broken up with seating areas. So when he was showing me this sketch, and we were having coffee in a little shop at Harvard, and I looked at the picture and I said, Peter Walker. He said, yes. He said, I'm in this design. This is my design. But Harvard is here, and so is Peter Walker. So, if you're wondering what these red squares are, you might think, well, they're tree pits or just some kind of decoration. But they're not. What Kung Jun Yu felt was that the students were all either one or two generations away from being the children of rice farmers themselves, or farmers in some way. These were not students whose fathers and grandfathers had gone to college. And he wanted to remind them of what their heritage was. So he didn't want a campus where you just walk by on your way to class and, there are some rice fields over there instead of lawn. He wanted them to be in it, to feel it viscerally. So this is one of those pods. They're very well organized and all alike, but you can see in this view, the rice is ripening, the students are studying, Actually, they remind me a lot of the students who were studying in Ben Gurion University in Israel. Same intention, same age. And, but they don't only sit in the middle of these rice fields. All the students plant the rice in the spring and harvest it in the fall. And then the college sells it and gives it away as souvenirs to esteemed guests. And so judging from all of these examples, we can maybe assume that the muse of landscape architecture is still active, but I think it takes more than the muse. So thank you very much.
And Susan continues to be generous and will answer some questions. So just raise your hand and.
I know Beatrice Farron said that one of her maxims was don't make the land fit the plan, make the plan fit the land. And I wonder, in looking at all of your various things in your wonderful book, whether you found that maxim to be particularly illuminating and whether you've ever seen people sort of break that rule successfully.
Yeah, I think it's been broken a lot successfully. You know that old saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. But the project I'm thinking of, I haven't seen yet, but it's Fresh Kills on Staten Island.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, they created landforms based on garbage mounds, but I'm sure they manipulated it. But that doesn't count. That's derelict brownfield land. I totally agree in principle with that guidance, though. And I just as you wouldn't put a Japanese garden in a suburban backyard unless you walled it off and it was a place to go to, like the secret garden in the movie, why would you do something that looked out of place? In fact, when I meet with a new client, I usually allow a few extra minutes when I drive to the place to just drive around the neighborhood and get a sense, if I don't know it, get a sense of what trees seem to thrive there, how far the houses are set back, things like that are so that you have a sense of place. Just drive up and say, oh, what can I do here? And also, this seems to be maybe a strange thing to say, but I really feel it. If people come to a project I've done, and the first thing they ask the owner is, who was your landscape architect? I feel I've failed. It shouldn't be that noticeable. They might say, oh, this place looks so nice. What a nice house you have. Because the landscape has helped the house look better, but it's not, it shouldn't be showy. It should be beautiful, but quiet, if that makes sense. More questions?
I'm wondering, obviously, once you became a landscape architect, you inevitably do now and have for years and years, drive around and think, what can I do with that?
All the time.
Right. But when you were a gardener at 30 or younger, for instance, was that same instinct, that same creative urge there for you? Do you think that had something to do with your choosing this profession because it was in you already?
I think it was. I just didn't, nobody told me. In fact, well, I'll answer in two parts. Nobody told me that this profession existed. And I majored in English, but my sister majored in art history. So nobody told her about landscape architecture. I called her, I said, I'm going to become a landscape architect when I'm 40. It actually took longer than that, and she said, what's a landscape architect? And, she'd studied architecture. So, but I had said, we moved to a little house on a corner, and the house faced a little dead-end street, but the garage doors faced the busy street. And we very soon realized that it was too small, but if we gave up our garage and turned it into a playroom, the house would last for a while, which it did. But then we had to close up the driveway. And my husband said, well, we can leave it there, you know, for extra parking or something. And I said, no, we need a green wall. And that's landscape architecture, you know, or the path to the front door. It feels funny because it's not wide enough. I noticed those things. For example, if you have a toddler with you, say there are two people and a toddler between them, which, let's face it, happens. If the walk is too small, one person has to let go of the toddler's hand. Well, that translates to a 6 foot wide walk. You should have a 6 foot wide walk to the front door, sort of a rule, my rule. But I don't tell people that because they think the dollar bills are miling up. You want to give them an expensive walk. But if you say, do you want to walk with your husband, with your child between you to the front door when you come home? Then they'll say, oh, right, we need the walk. And it's not just for that. It's that if you have a big house and the walk looks skinny, it's all out of proportion. So I was noticing things like that. And by the way, when I was a little girl, before our whole neighborhood was developed, there was a huge piece of woods. Well, it seemed huge. It was probably 3 or 4 building lots, but it seemed huge. And all the kids in the neighborhood would go there. And I used to love to go there. And I remember imagining in my mind, I was building houses in the woods, like this house could go here and that's what it would look like. And then, you know, I grew up and I didn't see a lot of girls studying landscape architecture. So I said, well, I guess that's not, you know, that's not something I could do. And I loved being an English major, but I always loved architecture too. So it was there. The other thing is, I don't know how many of you like maps, to read maps, and I mean, now we've got Google and everything, but I always used to love maps, and it was easy for me to read a map and say, oh, wait, 3 streets up and take a right, and we're there, right? Some people can't do that. If you can't do that, you'd have a hard time being a landscape designer because you have to look at something and know that that's the way the land is. And, you know, you can train yourself to know what's north and what's south by the time of day, which I do, you know. But I think I was born to be a landscape architect. I was a grandmother before I got licensed, though. So, yeah. Yes.
What are some of the parameters and restrictions that you have to operate under when designing an exhibition garden?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've done 2 plus the one I collaborated on for the New York Botanical Garden. And the first one was the first exhibition they ever had in the courtyard of the conservatory, you know, the 2 courtyards with the pools in them. And it was in one half. And I'd only been to Japan like 5 times. I'm still not a scholar of Japanese gardens. But I was called in and invited to design a garden in that space because the then vice president of the garden had been to Japan, fallen in love with Japan, and said, we want an exhibition garden in this space. Well, it's a Beaux-Arts space, it's not a Japanese space. So there were no restrictions. There were really no restrictions. It was just, Susan, we trust you, what can you do with this? The only restriction was financial, and I had a mason. I designed a Japanese path, and I noticed that it was in my drawing, but they weren't doing it. So I went to the woman, I said, what happened to the path? She said, we can't afford it. And I said, but what if my mason, she said, Susan, we can't afford it. I said, what if he did it for free and provided the stones? And he did, and she said, yeah. So that was the only restriction. It worked out fine. The other garden I did was the 15 sculptures from the Museum of Modern Art were on loan to NYBG for about 1.5 years during construction. The same construction that led to Ken Smith's project. And the restriction was I had to satisfy the leadership of the Museum of Modern Art. That was it. And that's a pretty big restriction. Also, the other restriction was one that I didn't even know when I started with the first exhibition. There are pipes under that land in those courtyards. So there's no soil there. So I had to make those gardens be above ground without people being aware that they were above ground. They were really like roof gardens. So I created these big containers. It worked. Well, they said it worked.
Hi,
Hi.
do you have any advice for people who are making the transition between doing gardening and just sort of maintenance to landscape design and architecture?
Absolutely. I can see you afterwards too, but, so I wanted to be a landscape architect because my father was a professional engineer. And when I heard about the field, I didn't know landscape designers were even a thing. So I made it as my goal, and it took a lot of years to do it, to get my, go to a professional school and get a license. So I had that, thing on the wall like my father had. But there are people who have wonderful careers by training to be landscape designers. If you want to be a landscape designer, you can go to places like the New York Botanical Garden, although I don't know of anyone else that has the kind of program they do on the East Coast, actually. But if you want to be a professional landscape architect, you have to go to an accredited school and then take the licensing exam. But in any case, you should start with taking courses. And the other thing to do is read books. I read so many books, just so many books. There's a book called something like The History of Landscape Design in 100 Gardens, written by Linda Chisholm, who taught at the Botanical Garden for years and years. It's a Timber Press book. And I love that book because it's like any field. I mean, clothing design, architecture, any creative endeavor, you have to know what came before you to know what to do, what others have done. But I'm happy, if you want to give me your email or something or phone number, I'm happy to talk about it. I hope it doesn't take you as long as it took me. Any other questions?
What's your favorite garden?
Oh, great. Corrence. So it's a garden, it's like a park. It's in France, it's a private garden, and it's filled with canals and moss, and it's old, and it has a terrific chateau, and it's not usually open to visitors, and I love it. So in France, that's my favorite garden. It's completely romantic. Corrence, it ends in ES. My favorite garden in England is everybody's favorite garden, probably Sissinghurst. I love Sissinghurst. And Japan, I like Katsura the best. It's a stroll garden. It's wonderful. Those are my 3 favorite gardens. Oh, I should find one in America, shouldn't I? Right here, right here.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. I was really interested in your comment about how gardens are related to the cultural context in which they exist. Like they might fit or they might not fit, and can be I don't know, disquieting, I suppose, to people that visit them. Like they kind of stick out and something feels disconnected there. I was wondering if you had any opinions about current trends in like American landscapes. I guess I'm most familiar with sort of home landscapes. Like I've heard of some people are really fond of vegetable gardens now. I've heard other folks criticize that. Oh, like there's deer in the street eating those freaking blueberries that's 2 feet on the road, or the kind of no-mow and wildflower thing. And for some people that's not mowing, and for others it's having a lot of gravel and then having plants grow up between the gravel so they don't have to mow. How
Well, I think the biggest trend is to try to be more ecologically conscious, and I think that's great. When I was in school in the 70s, I don't remember any emphasis at all on planting native plants. I mean, sometimes my first teacher would mention, trees that were native, like the dogwoods and, maples and oaks. But no one ever said, but don't plant cherry trees because they're from Japan and, plant a native dogwood instead. That wasn't an emphasis. And I think for all of our sakes, we should be aware of that. And people are. And pollinator pathways, but I don't think I could make a sweeping statement about, every landscape is, as I said before, I think, of its place. And, I don't know, I don't see any reason to plant blueberries along a sidewalk, for example, or as a border plant if you have deer and no deer fence. So, I mean, some things, most of it is common sense, I think. There'll always be fads. I just read in the New York Times today that the color to use throughout your whole house is cobalt blue. Did you see that? So, I happen to love blue gardens. My major garden in my house is not that big, but it's all blues and purples because I love the way blue and purple flower blossoms look against green. Like if you see Nepeta now, it's blooming everywhere, and you see it against a green lawn. That's just gorgeous. But it's not meant to be a trend. Gardens are personal. I don't think I helped you with answering that question.
The common sense comment in particular. I think the common sense comment in particular was it made sense in terms of, right, like, I mean, same thing with more cultural gardens. Like if you had a Japanese garden and the bamboo is spreading with your neighbor's lawn like that, it's not pregnant.
No, in fact, it's really naughty to do that. It's not nice.
Or something that is attractive to deer and
Right. It's a lot of it is common sense. And what I should have said about learning to be a landscape designer is that the most important thing that you can do is go see gardens. Every minute, go see gardens. And I was lucky when our children were little, we would go to generally England. It just happened when they were about 6 and 8. We went to England for a week. That was, my first little trip with the family. And my husband said, one of those days in the week, it's going to be your day and you're going to find gardens and we're all going to look at gardens, English gardens. It was his idea. And so I researched the English gardens. I'd never been to see an English garden. And I came up with Sissinghurst and Great Dixter. I had advice from my professors who taught landscape history, and they said these two are kind of close together. He lent me books on Gertrude Jekyll. And so I studied up, and then the next year we got to go back and we traded houses once or twice. And so I saw a lot of English gardens. And every time we came home from England, I would make my garden bed a little deeper. It had a wall that was at one point like 6 or 8 feet tall, and the garden in front of it was 2 feet out from the wall. And I would make it bigger and more generous because even if you go to Old Westbury, which is a fantastic garden, if you've been to England, the garden beds seem too small. And if you go to England, you can have a 20-foot deep flower border. So anyway, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but that's the kind of thing I learned, is going to gardens, so I made it. And when the garden actually got to be as far away from the wall as the wall was high, so here's the wall, here's the garden, like that, the wall didn't disappear, but it just settled into the ground. So I call that Cohen's law. I use it all the time. And so I learned that in England by just visiting. And one of the best ways to see gardens is to become a member of the Garden Conservancy and go to all their open days. You don't have to go be a member, but it helps because you get their book and then you can plot your Saturday trip or your Sunday. And see the gardens around Litchfield or the gardens around, the northern New Jersey. And it's so inspiring. And a lot of those are not done by professionals. They're done by talented homeowners who are just dedicated to making beautiful gardens. And some do have professional help, but they're a fantastic thing to do during the summer. And it's practically free. It's $5 a garden or something. And for any student or lover of gardens, it's a wonderful thing to do. After you've been here, of course.
Please help me thank Susan. That was just so warm and personal. Really appreciate it. We have a very small gift to you to thank you for your generosity.
I was admiring that. That is gorgeous.
There's also some Beatrix Ferrin gift cards next to it to take home. So thank you again so much.
It's beautiful.
So please come back to the garden, join us for a small reception. As I mentioned, there are some plants from the plant sale this week that are available to take home for a free will donation, and some lovely floral arrangements that our volunteer weeders made just before that also can be taken home. So see you over there. Thank you for coming.